Good evening from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX is counting down to another launch this evening. The Falcon 9 rocket is vertical in preparation for liftoff tonight. The launch window tonight opens at 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 3:26 a.m. UTC for those of you watching from other time zones. That's 1 hour and 9 minutes away. The payload for tonight's mission is named Hotbird 13F. This is a TV broadcasting satellite destined to provide television programming and video relay services across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This satellite is owned by Eutelsat, which is a Paris-based company, one of the largest geostationary satellite operators in the world. And the spacecraft on board the Falcon 9 rocket was built by Airbus. Hotbird 13F is currently closed up inside the nose cone of the Falcon 9 out on pad 40. Weather conditions this evening look favorable for liftoff. The latest, most recent forecast we've seen indicated a 90% probability of favorable conditions for liftoff this evening. There was only a slight concern in that forecast for cumulus clouds, which may cause a threat of lightning. But generally, weather conditions were forecast to be favorable, and that's the way it's shaping up this evening. There are no thunderstorms anywhere in the immediate vicinity. There are some scattered clouds over the launch site at this time, but right now we don't think those are exceeding any limit or any of the weather criteria for the Falcon 9 to get off the pad tonight. The launch window tonight is rather long. It's an hour and 56 minutes in length. So the window opens again at 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time and runs until 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. And for those of you in other time zones around the world, that is 3:26 a.m. UTC until 5:22 a.m. UTC. As we get started with our coverage tonight, we'll ask you to please hit the like button on our stream. That really helps us gain a larger following and get as many people watching our coverage as we can. This should be a spectacular late night launch from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station to launch us into the weekend. Again, this mission carrying Hotbird 13F, a communications satellite for the company Eutelsat, and the satellite was built by Airbus. T-minus 60 minutes and counting. We're now an hour away from the opening of tonight's launch window. Again, the launch window opens at 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 3:26 a.m. UTC, and runs for an hour and 56 minutes. That's a rather long launch window compared to the usual length of launch windows for SpaceX missions. Many of those are instantaneous or near instantaneous, particularly for missions carrying Starlink internet satellites, as well as missions that are targeting a rendezvous and docking with the International Space Station. Those missions come with strict trajectory requirements and strict orbital insertion requirements that restrict the duration of the launch window to instantaneous or near instantaneous length. Tonight's mission is not targeting a rendezvous with another object in space or any specific orbital plane. Therefore, there is flexibility in the timeline this evening with an hour and 56 minutes of launch window available to SpaceX to work with. Again, this mission is carrying a geostationary communications satellite called Hotbird 13F for Eutelsat. It's on its way to an orbital position over the equator at an altitude of 22,300 miles or so. That's about 36,000 kilometers. And missions like this one typically have launch windows that are primarily constrained with sunlight on the solar arrays when those solar arrays begin deploying, or when the satellite actually deploys from the rocket. The spacecraft operators typically want good, favorable lighting either at separation or shortly after separation from the rocket to begin recharging the satellite's batteries. That's one of the main drivers of launch windows for missions like this one heading to a geostationary transfer orbit, which is an elliptical drop-off orbit, essentially. So the Falcon 9 will place this satellite into an oval-shaped orbit around planet Earth, and then we'll deploy the spacecraft at 36 minutes after launch. And then the spacecraft itself will use its own propulsion system to circularize its orbit over the equator. These maneuvers are sometimes called orbit-raising maneuvers. And then Hotbird 13F will settle into a position in geostationary orbit, and at that altitude at 22,000 miles, it will be orbiting in lockstep with the planet's rotation and give the spacecraft a fixed geographic coverage area. In this case, it's heading for a slot in geostationary orbit along the equator at 13 degrees east longitude, and from that position, it will be able to serve consumers and television households across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. You may have noticed in the upper right, the countdown clock has been adjusted from less than an hour remaining until launch until now showing an hour, 55 minutes, 34 seconds. So this does possibly suggest that the launch time tonight has changed. Again, I mentioned there's an hour and 56-minute launch window available for SpaceX tonight. So that countdown clock is now counting down to 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 4:26 a.m. UTC. We'll stand by for some confirmation of the change in launch time to make sure that this is indeed the case. SpaceX has now confirmed the new target launch time, just as we reported a few minutes ago, of 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 4:26 a.m. UTC. So a 1-hour delay in tonight's launch from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The launch window this evening runs until 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC. So still nearly a 1 hour to work with in tonight's window. But right now, the target launch time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is at 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time, 4:26 a.m. UTC. And SpaceX says this delay will allow additional time for data review without elaborating on what sort of data they are reviewing. So they're reviewing data, and launch is now targeted for 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time with the Hotbird 13F TV broadcasting satellite. Again, if you're just joining us, the launch time tonight has slipped by 1 hour, so there's a 1 hour delay in the countdown this evening. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is now targeted for 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time, or 4:26 a.m. UTC. SpaceX says this 1 hour delay will allow additional time for a data review, and the company did not elaborate on what sort of data was being reviewed. But if whatever issue or data review is ongoing is resolved and cleared, and SpaceX proceeds with a launch attempt tonight at 12:26 a.m., here's a look at the countdown timeline that we can expect to run through tonight. At T-minus 35 minutes, propellant loading on board the Falcon 9 is expected to get underway. This will involve loading about 1 million pounds of densified kerosene and liquid oxygen into the two-stage vehicle out on pad 40. At T-minus 20 minutes or so, the second stage kerosene tank should be full. And at T-minus 16 minutes, we should hear confirmation of second stage liquid oxygen loading. So the propellant loading actually begins when loading 3 tanks on the Falcon 9, the first stage fuel and oxidizer tank and the second stage fuel tank. And the second stage oxidizer tank doesn't begin loading until T-minus 16 minutes. Once we get down into the final 10 minutes of the countdown, action begins to pick up. At T-minus 7 minutes, engine chill down will begin. This is the thermal conditioning of the 9 Merlin 1D engines at the bottom of the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the first stage fuel tank should be full of kerosene fuel. At T-minus 4.5 minutes, the strongback will begin retracting away from the Falcon 9 rocket to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. That's where it will remain until liftoff, and at liftoff that strongback will swing back in a more rapid fashion to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to climb off the pad. At T-minus 2 minutes, the liquid oxygen loading on both stages should be complete. And at that time, the fill and drain valves will be closed, and the Falcon 9 propellant tanks will be fully loaded for launch with the Hotbird 13F spacecraft. At 60 seconds, the Falcon 9 will transition to what's known as startup. This is when the Falcon 9's onboard computer takes command of the countdown. The Falcon 9 also at this point will be operating on internal battery power and will be off of its ground power supply. Also in the final minute of the countdown, the Falcon 9's propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. And at T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will give their final go for launch. At T-minus 3 seconds, we'll begin the ignition sequence for the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the first stage. This involves the use of a ignition fluid, igniter fluid called aluminum triethyl borane, or TTEB, as it's known. That comes with a distinctive green flash that for night launches sometimes is rather easy to pick up visually, and that'll be followed by the orange glow of engine ignition. And then at T0, when the clock hits 0, the hold down clamps at the base of the rocket will release, and the Falcon 9 will begin its climb off the pad with the Hotbird 13F satellite. Again, this is what we can expect to see in the countdown later tonight, if the countdown does proceed this evening after this data review that SpaceX says is currently ongoing. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 rocket will be heading east from Cape Canaveral. This red line on this map delineates roughly where the Falcon 9 ground track will be out over the Atlantic Ocean. We've labeled Space Launch Complex 40, the starting point for tonight's mission here, as well as labeled the location of the drone ship. Just read the instructions, which is one of 3 football field-sized rocket landing vessels in SpaceX's fleet. This particular drone ship is holding position about 410 miles, or 660 kilometers, east of Cape Canaveral tonight, and the Falcon 9's first stage booster will aim to land on that vessel less than 9 minutes after launch. So the Falcon 9 booster will cover 410 miles in just shy of 9 minutes. The Falcon 9 booster on tonight's mission is designated booster 1069 or B1069, and will be going for its third flight this evening. And as is the case with all Falcon 9 missions, the second stage is a brand new element of the rocket. The second stage is not reusable. Again, we're looking now live again, full screen at Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 is awaiting a launch opportunity tonight, now set for 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time or 4:26 a.m. UTC. We're now about 90 minutes away from the new target launch time this evening for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. That new target launch time is at 12:26 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 4:26 a.m. UTC. This is a 1-hour delay from the original target launch time tonight, which was 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time. SpaceX says they're taking this additional hour to allow time for additional data review. SpaceX did not elaborate on the reason they need to do this data review or what kind of data is being reviewed, but clearly they want to take some extra time just to make sure everything is ready for launch tonight. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, about 4 miles away from my location, where SpaceX has a Falcon 9 rocket vertical this evening for liftoff with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F television broadcasting satellite. The Falcon 9 will give this satellite a ride to an elliptical geostationary transfer orbit that stretches as far as 22,000 miles above the Earth on the highest point of its trajectory, or apogee. This spacecraft weighs about 4.5 metric tons, and it's currently encapsulated inside the nose cone, or payload fairing, of the Falcon 9 rocket out on Pad 40. The 4 towers you see on each side of the Falcon 9 are lightning protection masts that are there to protect the Falcon 9 rocket from a direct lightning strike while it's vertical on the pad. As you can see, there's no mobile service tower, as there often is at other launch pads, to protect the Falcon 9 from the elements while it's out on the pad. So these lightning towers are there to protect the rocket from lightning strikes, which are a common occurrence here in Florida. No immediate risk of lightning tonight. The weather forecast this evening calls for a 90% probability of favorable weather, so the weather not anticipated to be an issue tonight. There are some scattered clouds over the spaceport right now, including a cloud right over the launch pad. But these clouds we don't expect to be a major concern tonight. The only weather concern tonight was with a slight risk of cumulus clouds that may be too thick or may hold an electrical charge that could create a risk of lightning as the Falcon 9 climbs into the sky over Cape Canaveral. But the weather forecasters believe that's only a very slight risk tonight. There are some rain showers and thunderstorms well off to the south from the Cape Canaveral area down towards South Florida tonight. We can actually see some of those lightning flashes way off on the southern horizon here. But those storms are 100 miles or so, almost 100 miles or so away from the spaceport. No thunderstorms anywhere near Cape Canaveral at this hour. We've seen the waning gibbous moon rise off the eastern horizon a few minutes ago. And we can see some stars overhead intermixed with these scattered clouds over the Space Center right now. An hour and 26 minutes away from the target launch time for tonight's mission. The launch window opens at 11:26 p.m. Eastern, and as I mentioned, SpaceX has already informed us of a 1-hour delay tonight, so the target launch time is currently at 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time, or 4:26 a.m. UTC, and the launch window actually runs all the way until 1:22 a.m. Eastern. So right now the target launch time is roughly the middle of this 1-hour 56-minute launch window tonight. If you're just joining us, I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, reporting live from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 over at neighboring Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where a Falcon 9 rocket is awaiting a launch attempt tonight. Liftoff currently is scheduled for 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time or 4:26 a.m. UTC, with the Hotbird 13F communications satellite. This is a television broadcasting platform for Eutelsat. Launch has been delayed 1 hour to allow additional time for some data review, according to SpaceX. If you're just joining our stream and you haven't had a chance to hit the like button, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream, because that helps us gain as big of an audience as possible for tonight's middle of the night liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. It should be a spectacular show, and we want to bring that to as many people as possible, so please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That really does us a favor, and we'd appreciate that. Now, 1 hour and 20 minutes and 20 seconds until the new target launch time tonight. can see the countdown clock is now holding at 1 hour, 8 minutes, and 16 seconds. So this does suggest that the launch will not be happening at the most recent updated target time of 12:26 a.m. Eastern Time. So it seems to be we're facing another delay this evening. Not sure if they'll target a new launch time. Again, the launch window tonight does extend all the way until 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, and the clock is now ticking again. So now 1 hour, 8 minutes, and 7 seconds, and counting. We've seen some action on that countdown clock over the last couple of minutes here at Cape Canaveral, and the clock has been readjusted to target a new time, a new launch time of 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC, and that is also the closing time of tonight's window. So the window tonight that SpaceX had available was 1 hour and 56 minutes. And they've now delayed the target launch time by that amount of time, 1 hour and 56 minutes. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 from Pad 40 is currently scheduled for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. Again, this is the closure of tonight's launch window, and any additional delay would force a scrub and a delay until at least Saturday night, no earlier than Saturday night, 24-hour delay, with no additional time now for SpaceX to work any issues. The latest report we had from SpaceX was that the delay from the original target launch time of 11:26 p.m. was due to a data review, that the time they needed to conduct additional data review before proceeding into tonight's launch attempt. Presumably that is still what is holding up the launch tonight. Again, liftoff now scheduled for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, or 5:22 a.m. UTC. While we wait for the launch tonight, if you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. It helps us gain a larger audience as we build up for hopefully what we're expecting to see tonight, which is the liftoff of the 23-story tall Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40 with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F communications satellite. If you want to support our coverage, you can also join our YouTube channel. If you become a member of our YouTube channel, you can gain access to exclusive members-only bonus video features from our coverage of the launch and space industries here on Florida's Space Coast and around the world. You'll also be supporting our coverage and helping us bring you live events like this one, like this launch tonight of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. So please consider signing up to join our YouTube channel. That really helps us with our coverage and helps us continue to do what we're doing here at Kennedy Space Center. You can also contribute through the Super Chat function here on YouTube, and we would really appreciate that contribution as well. We do want to thank YouTube user Red Frog for their contribution on Super Chat a few minutes ago. And if anyone else wants to chime in there, we'd appreciate that as well. Now less than 2 hours now until the revised target launch time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. While we're waiting for what we hope to be a launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket tonight, here's a look at some of the main components of the Falcon 9 as it stands vertical out on pad 40. This is a 229-foot tall launch vehicle. That's about 70 meters in height, more than 20 stories tall. The bottom two-thirds of the vehicle is made up by the first stage booster. We've labeled that here. That booster contains a kerosene tank at the bottom, a portion of that structure. Above that is the liquid oxygen tank. At the very bottom of the first stage booster are 9 Merlin 1D main engines, and these engines will combine to generate about 1.7 million pounds of thrust to propel the Falcon 9 rocket off of pad 40 with the Hotbird 13F communications satellite. This booster is tail number 1069, so booster 1069, and it is flying for the third time. This reusable booster has flown twice before. It first flew on a Falcon 9 mission to resupply the International Space Station last December, and after landing on one of SpaceX's drone ships in the Atlantic Ocean, rough seas caused that booster to lose its balance, essentially, and it sustained some damage to its engines and landing legs. Some of those components, some of that hardware was replaced as SpaceX engineers and technicians repaired the booster over the course of several months earlier this year. And that booster finally returned to SpaceX's rotation of reusable boosters back in August with a Starlink launch, a launch that carried a batch of Starlink internet satellites to space. And booster 1069, now repaired with 2 flights under its belt, is back on the pad tonight for this mission for Eutelsat. Above the first stage, that black band is known as the inner stage. That is a carbon composite structure there that connects the first stage booster with the second stage. The second stage is powered by a single Merlin vacuum engine, similar in design to the Merlin 1D engines on the first stage. But the Merlin vacuum has an expansion engine nozzle, a wider, larger engine bell that is optimized for thrust in vacuum, and that engine will produce about 200,000 pounds of thrust during launch to place the Hotbird 13F satellite into orbit. It'll actually fire 2 times on this mission, first to place the payload into a preliminary parking orbit, and then to propel Hotbird 13F into its higher transfer orbit, geostationary transfer orbit, to set up for spacecraft separation. The second stage on every Falcon 9 rocket is not reusable. It is a single-use element of the vehicle. It's basically the only significant part of the rocket that SpaceX is not able to recover and reuse. Above that is the 2-piece payload fairing. These 2 clamshell halves are actually encapsulating the Hotbird 13F spacecraft awaiting liftoff tonight. And the payload fairing, those 2 halves will descend under parachute and splash down in the Atlantic Ocean for recovery by SpaceX recovery forces. I should have mentioned the first stage, of course, will be targeting a landing on SpaceX's drone ship. Just read the instructions, positioned about 400 miles downrange tonight in the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a look at SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. This will be the 47th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket overall this year, and the 181st launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since the workhorse vehicle made its debut flight back in June of 2010 from pad 40. And tonight's mission, interestingly, also is the 100th Falcon 9 launch to actually originate from pad 40 to take off from this launch complex at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. SpaceX has 3 active Falcon 9 launch pads, 2 here in Florida. You're looking at one of them at pad 40. A few miles to the north is pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. And then SpaceX also operates Space Launch Complex 4 East, Slick 4E as it's known, at Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California for polar orbit missions. Pad 40 in action tonight is the most used of those 3 pads. So this will be SpaceX's 100th launch from Pad 40. Pad 40 has its origins back in the 1960s for the Air Force's Titan rocket program. There were 55 Titan rocket launches from Pad 40 all the way up until 2005. The last Titan 4 rocket launched from this pad in 2005, and then the pad was converted for use by SpaceX, which launched its first Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40, again, as I mentioned, back in 2010. So we thank you for sticking with us during these launch delays tonight. We should have seen the Falcon 9 take off. We were expecting to see it take off at least nearly 9 minutes ago at 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time. But SpaceX delayed that launch time by an hour initially to allow additional time for some data review, the company said. And now SpaceX has again pushed back the target launch time tonight to the very end of tonight's launch window, which is at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time or 5:22 a.m. UTC. That's an hour and 47 minutes away. We'll be back with some periodic updates over the course of the next hour or so. The countdown really picks up at T-minus 35 minutes when propellant loading begins. That's when the automated countdown sequencer also takes control of the final pre-launch operations. And kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants will begin flowing into the Falcon 9 at T-minus 35 minutes. Also at this point in the countdown, probably already complete at this point since SpaceX was targeting an earlier launch time, the security teams across the spaceport erect roadblocks and make sure that the launch hazard area, which is the downrange maritime waters and as well as the airspace along the flight corridor out of the atmosphere immediately around the Space Center, as well as downrange to the east out over the Atlantic Ocean, is clear. Want to make sure there are no boats or any aircraft in those areas. And they also want to make sure that all personnel are evacuated from what's known as the Blast Danger Area, or BDA. That's the area immediately around the launch pad where a person could be endangered during the launch or in the event of any accident during the launch that may spread debris over the area around the launch pad. So we're about an hour and 45 minutes now from the new target launch time tonight. Again, that T0 time, as it's known, is at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. And we'll be back with more updates as we receive them. And we'll continue to be streaming these live views of Pad 40. We're now 90 minutes away from the new target launch time tonight, which is at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, or 5:22 UTC. If you're just joining us, SpaceX has delayed tonight's Falcon 9 launch to the end of tonight's launch window. The window opened at 11:26 p.m. Eastern Time and runs until 1:22 a.m. And SpaceX is now targeting the end of the window at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC, for liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket. You're looking at a live shot of Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX's Falcon 9 is vertical. The rocket stands 229 feet, or about 70 meters in height, and it's awaiting liftoff with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F communications satellite. Now inside of 1 hour, 28 minutes until tonight's new launch time of 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, or 5:22 a.m. UTC. This will be the fourth launch of a Falcon 9 rocket this month, as SpaceX continues to launch these missions on a cadence of about once per week on average. About once every 6 days is actually the cadence they've been achieving so far in 2022. Last week, SpaceX launched 3 different Falcon 9 missions. One of those was the Crew 5 mission, carrying 3 astronauts and 1 Russian cosmonaut to the International Space Station. That occurred back on October the 5th from Kennedy Space Center. Later that same day, SpaceX launched a Falcon 9 rocket from California with another batch of Starlink internet satellites. Just about 7 hours actually separated that Crew 5 launch and the Starlink launch. That was the shortest interval between 2 Falcon 9 missions in SpaceX's history. And then last Saturday, 6 nights ago, from Pad 40, the pad you're watching right now, SpaceX launched 2 Eutelsat television broadcasting satellites, Galaxy 33 and 34, on a Falcon 9 rocket. And again, SpaceX's launch team is on console this evening at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, hoping to launch this Falcon 9 rocket with Hotbird 13F tonight. You're continuing to watch a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, reporting live a few miles away at Kennedy Space Center. The new target launch time for tonight's mission is 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC. And if you watch the clock in the upper right of this view, that is the clock ticking down to the new updated target launch time, 1 hour, 19 minutes, and 23 seconds and counting. Again, SpaceX has delayed this launch by nearly 2 hours tonight to perform additional data reviews. SpaceX has not elaborated on what kind of data is being reviewed or the reason for the delay in any specific terms, other than saying this allows additional time for some data review. So engineers are poring over that data that they're reviewing, and we hope to see SpaceX launch this Falcon 9 rocket at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. This is the end of tonight's launch window, so any additional delay tonight would result in a postponement of this mission for at least 24 hours until the backup launch window on Saturday night. Again, this mission is hauling a satellite named Hotbird 13F into orbit for Eutelsat. While we wait for news or an update on the status of tonight's launch attempt, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. This helps us gain a larger audience and a bigger following for our coverage. If this mission does blast off tonight, we want as many people watching as possible. So please hit the like button. That really helps us in that regard. You can also support our coverage by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. If you join, depending on which membership tier you choose, you can gain access to exclusive bonus video features for members only. These are bonus features from our coverage here of launches and other spaceflight activity at Cape Canaveral. And this helps us continue and expand our coverage of these launches, which are occurring at a record cadence this year. This is the 47th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket this year from SpaceX's 3 active launch pads, 2 here in Florida, 1 out in California. This is the 45th space launch attempt from a launch pad here on Florida Space Coast this year. These 44 previous missions this year include launches primarily by SpaceX, but the tally does also include launches by United Launch Alliance with its Atlas V rocket, as well as 2 space launch attempts which failed to achieve orbit, but they're counted in this tally because they were space launch attempts by the small satellite launch company Astra earlier this year. The record for the number of space launch attempts in a calendar year before 2022 was 32 in a single year, and we blew by that back in late July. And tonight's mission will be number 45. We just passed T-minus 1 hour and 5 minutes until the new target launch time this morning at Cape Canaveral. That new target launch time is a 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, or 5:22 a.m. UTC. And if SpaceX is going to proceed with a launch attempt this morning, here's what we can expect to see in the final 35 minutes of the countdown. We're about 30 minutes actually away from the time that we would expect to see the start of propellant load on board the Falcon 9, when liquid oxygen and kerosene will begin flowing into the vehicle. That is due to begin at T-minus 35 minutes, so less than 30 minutes away now. The second stage liquid oxygen tank will begin loading at T-minus 16 minutes, so the prop load actually begins with 3 tanks: the first stage fuel and oxidizer tank, and the second stage fuel tank. The second stage oxidizer tank doesn't start loading until T-minus 16 minutes. And then once the countdown is in the final 10 minutes, action picks up with chill down or thermal conditioning of the Merlin first stage engines at T-minus 7 minutes. At about T-minus 4 minutes 30 seconds, the strongback mast next to the vehicle will recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees away from the Falcon 9 and hold there until engines start and liftoff. And at T-minus 2 minutes, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded with about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants. And then the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown at T-minus 60 seconds and begin pressurizing the propellant tanks. And the SpaceX launch director will give their final go for launch at 45 seconds. And once the tanks are pressurized, the engine controller will give the command to light the 9 Merlin 1D engines at T-minus 3 seconds. And that will culminate, assuming the engines pass their automated health check, with a liftoff at T-minus 0 to begin tonight's climb to orbit with the Hotbird 13F communications satellite. The booster flying tonight is booster 1069. This is a booster that's flown twice before. It launched for the first time back on December the 21st of last year with the CRS-24 mission. That was a space station cargo flight on with a Dragon spacecraft heading up to the ISS. The booster was damaged after landing due to rough seas. It damaged some of the engines as well as landing legs, and the rocket actually came back in on a tilt when it returned to Port Canaveral aboard its drone ship. But after some repairs and some swaps of those engines and landing legs, earlier this year, SpaceX returned the booster to service with a Starlink launch with the Starlink Internet satellites back on August the 27th. And now booster 1069 is a regular part of SpaceX's rotation of reusable boosters. This first stage will target a landing after liftoff this morning on the drone ship. Just read the instructions, which is parked about 410 miles or 660 kilometers east of Cape Canaveral. That booster will target the landing on the drone ship while the second stage continues into orbit with the payload for this mission, which is the Eutelsat Hotbird 13F TV broadcasting satellite. While we wait for the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket this morning, earlier Friday evening we were covering the return of SpaceX's Crew 4 mission from the International Space Station. This is a video replay from a NASA TV showing the SpaceX Dragon Freedom spacecraft descending under the 4 orange and white main parachutes heading toward a splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of Jacksonville, Florida. This splashdown occurred at 4:55 p.m. Eastern Time, 2055 UTC. There are 4 astronauts on board this crew capsule for this reentry and splashdown. They have been on the International Space Station since late April. They launched back on April the 27th from Kennedy Space Center and returned to Earth on Friday evening with the splashdown in the Atlantic. The commander of this mission, Jill Lindgren, the pilot, Bob Hines, were accompanied by mission specialists Samantha Cristoforetti and Jessica Watkins. Lindgren and Cristoforetti concluded their second trips to space. Hines and Watkins were both rookies heading into this mission, now veterans of one space flight each. They spent 170 days in orbit, most of that on board the International Space Station, conducting scientific experiments and maintenance on the space station during their long-duration expedition. They were replaced last week with the Crew 5 astronauts. Here's splashdown again, occurring a few hours ago in the Atlantic Ocean, northeast of Jacksonville, Florida. The Crew Dragon Freedom spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere a few hours, about 5 hours after undocking from the space station to return this 4-person crew to Earth after 170 days in space. SpaceX's recovery boat named Megan was on station to retrieve the capsule from the ocean and to help the 4 astronauts from the spacecraft. About a half hour after splashdown, they were actually on board the vessel and helped out of the spacecraft to undergo their preliminary medical evaluations, and then the crew will be flown back to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. So that was the return of the Dragon Freedom spacecraft from the International Space Station a few hours ago. So another busy day for SpaceX today with the return of the astronauts from the ISS, and now we're inside 55 minutes until tonight's, or this morning's now, launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with Hotbird 13F. This is a 4.5 metric ton communications satellite for Eutelsat, built by Airbus, heading to space to provide television broadcasts and programming across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. SpaceX's countdown now has passed the T-minus 50-minute mark. This is the farthest into the countdown that we've seen for this launch attempt tonight. If SpaceX is proceeding with a launch attempt and a final countdown this morning, we're about 14 minutes away from the time that SpaceX would start loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. That has to begin at T-minus 35 minutes in order for tonight's launch to proceed. Liftoff time at last report remains scheduled for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC. Now less than 49 minutes away from now. This is the end of tonight's launch window, so any additional delay tonight would result in a scrub and a rescheduling of the launch attempt with Hotbird 13F until no earlier than Saturday night, which is the backup launch opportunity for this mission. Now T-minus 45 minutes and counting. 10 minutes away from the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. At this time, we believe that SpaceX, for now, is proceeding with their preparations for launch at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC for those of you in other time zones. Now T-minus 43 minutes and counting. You're continuing to watch a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 as we've been streaming now for a couple of hours, showing the Falcon 9 rocket awaiting its opportunity to fly tonight from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com, and I'll be providing commentary throughout the remainder of the countdown and the climb into orbit with the Falcon 9 rocket and the Hotbird 13F television broadcasting satellite. That's the primary and sole payload on this mission. This is a communications satellite built by Airbus Defence and Space in Europe. It was assembled in Toulouse, France, and was shipped by aircraft to Cape Canaveral last month to undergo final preparations for launch. And that's all culminating in tonight's countdown, which has been delayed nearly 2 hours to allow additional time for some data reviews. But right now, we believe the countdown is on schedule, on track for launch at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time.
Folks, propellant load and launch go no-go polls open for buy at this time. Looking for buys from mission manager.
And that's the voice from SpaceX Launch Control indicating that the countdown clock, or the countdown poll, is underway. This is an electronic poll of various members of the launch team. This launch team is stationed in a control center a few miles south of Pad 40, just outside the southern gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And this is, again, an electronic poll, so you won't be hearing go, no-go from various members of the launch team. They register their status electronically by computer, and that shows up on the display for the launch conductor and launch director. If the poll is go, propellant loading would begin at T-minus 35 minutes.
Polling's complete. Go for propellant load and launch.
And there's confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the poll is complete. Good news. Go for propellant load and launch. So SpaceX will start loading propellants, kerosene and liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket in less than 5 minutes time at T-minus 35 minutes. T-minus 37 minutes and counting. 2 minutes away from the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. We heard a few moments ago.
Tanks maintained for propellant load.
Heard a few moments ago that SpaceX's launch team is go for propellant loading. We're now listening to periodic call-outs from SpaceX Launch Control. When those are coming up, I'll pause any commentary that I'm providing so we can listen in directly to the launch team.
Countdown reminder for abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief CE or LD and they'll approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control abort the launch auto immediately and proceed to launch abort auto. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count. Stand by to pick up the launch auto.
Now 30 seconds away from the start of the launch auto sequence. That's when the countdown is handed over to a computer, a ground-side computer that controls the final 35 minutes of the countdown. Then that computer actually hands off to a computer on board the Falcon 9 rocket itself at T-minus 60 seconds.
Launch auto sequence has started.
There's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started, and at this time propellants are now flowing onto the Falcon 9 rocket out at pad 40. The propellant loading process begins with filling 3 of the 4 propellant tanks. So right now kerosene and liquid oxygen are flowing into the first stage of the Falcon 9, and kerosene fuel is also being pumped into the second stage of the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen will not begin loading onto the vehicle until around T-minus 16 minutes. These propellants are being loaded through transfer lines leading from the ground storage tanks for RP1, which is the kerosene fuel for the Falcon 9. RP1 stands for Rocket Propellant 1. This is a highly refined grade of kerosene. It's a hydrocarbon fuel that feeds the Merlin engines on the first and second stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. Concurrently with loading of RP1 kerosene is the loading of liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen is a cryogenic propellant oxidizer, chilled to a temperature of several hundred degrees below zero. Typically it's stored at minus 298 degrees Fahrenheit, but for SpaceX missions, for SpaceX rockets, that temperature is actually even colder because it's a densified oxidizer, super chilled. That allows SpaceX to actually load additional molecules of the liquid oxygen into the vehicle to give the Falcon 9 a performance boost. The same is true for kerosene. Kerosene is typically stored at roughly room temperature. It's storable over long periods of time inside propellant tanks. For the Falcon 9, that kerosene is actually chilled down closer to its freezing point. Again, same basic thought there, that allows additional molecules of fuel to be loaded into the vehicle, and essentially that gives the Falcon 9 the ability to not only haul heavier cargo, heavier payloads into orbit, it also ensures that the Falcon 9 booster, the first stage, has enough reserve propellant to perform its landing maneuvers. It'll relight 3 of its engines on the way back through the atmosphere for an entry burn, and then it will relight 1 of its 9 engines, the center engine, about 30 seconds before landing for a final braking maneuver to allow the rocket to settle for a vertical touchdown on the drone ship positioned about 410 miles east of the Cape tonight. Now less than 32 minutes remaining until launch time of the Falcon 9 rocket and the Hotbird 13F satellite. If you're just joining us, thanks for joining us. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where a Falcon 9 rocket is now less than 31 minutes away from launch and is currently being loaded with fuel and oxidizer for the mission to carry Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F communications satellite into orbit tonight. The launch was delayed about 2 hours to allow additional time for some unspecified data reviews, according to SpaceX. Teams now apparently are comfortable with proceeding with launch this morning, and the teams gave a go for propellant loading about 10 minutes ago, and that propellant loading began about 5 minutes ago at T-minus 35 minutes. Here's a view of the expected ground track for tonight's mission. The Falcon 9 will be targeting a geostationary transfer orbit. This means the rocket will head due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station out over the Atlantic Ocean. We've labeled the location of Space Launch Complex 40, the departure point for tonight's mission, here on Cape Canaveral. And we've also noted the position of the drone ship. Just read the instructions, about 410 miles or 660 kilometers downrange in the Atlantic Ocean. That drone ship is holding position. That's where the first stage booster will come down for landing about 9 minutes after launch. So again, this red ground track shows the expected trajectory and flight path for the Falcon 9 rocket, which is aiming to deploy the Hotbird 13F satellite into an elliptical geostationary transfer orbit on the way to an operating position in geostationary orbit over the equator at an altitude of 22,300 miles or so. That's nearly 36,000 kilometers. To reach that orbit, that equatorial orbit, the rocket needs to head due east, and that's the trajectory we see here on this map tonight. Less than 28.5 minutes now until launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40. We're now seeing some of the frost building up on the outer skin of the Falcon 9 booster. This comes from the loading of this cryogenic, super cold liquid oxygen, several hundred degrees below zero. That causes the frost and ice to build up on the airframe of the Falcon 9 booster. You can also see some of the vapors, condensed vapors around that circular booster as well. The very bottom of the first stage booster is actually the kerosene tank, which is a warmer fluid, warmer liquid, where you don't see the ice build up. Above that is the liquid oxygen tank. That runs all the way up to the top of that first stage, to the top where it intersects the interstage. That's the black band. So that whole section of the first stage booster will be covered in ice by the time propellant loading is completed for this morning's countdown. And you'll be able to see that oxidizer level, that oxidizer tank, actually fill up you'll see the frost level rise on that first stage booster over the remainder of the countdown. T-minus 24 minutes and counting. You're continuing to watch a live shot of Space Launch Complex 40 and SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, counting down to liftoff at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That is 5:22 a.m. UTC for our viewers in other time zones around the world. T-minus 23 minutes and 15 seconds and counting. The payload for tonight's mission is Hotbird 13F. It's one of two nearly identical new Hotbird TV broadcasting satellites you see here in this video provided by Airbus. Hotbird 13F and 13G are both scheduled to launch on Falcon 9 rockets. 13F is going tonight. 13G will be launched on a future Falcon 9 launch in November. This time-lapse video comes from Airbus again, showing some of the major milestones in the construction and assembly of the Hotbird 13F satellite. The payload module that contains the communications equipment that will be broadcasting the TV channels was manufactured in Portsmouth, England, and then was shipped over to France for final assembly with the spacecraft bus in Toulouse at Airbus's satellite factory. You see here some of the testing, some of the vibration testing that went on to prepare the satellite for launch to make sure it was ready to withstand all the dynamics and stresses of a launch. Hotbird 13F is based on a new Airbus satellite platform called the Eurostar Neo platform. This is an upgraded variant of Airbus's Eurostar satellite bus with upgrades to the propulsion system, upgrades to the power and thermal control systems as well. And this is the first Eurostar Neo satellite bus launching tonight with the Hotbird 13F mission. We're back to a live shot of pad 40 where the Falcon 9 is now inside of 22 minutes until launch. We've just passed 1 a.m. local time here in Florida.
Stage 2, fuel load complete.
We heard the call a moment ago from SpaceX Launch Control that the fuel load onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket is complete. So that tank has been filled with its supply of RP-1 kerosene fuel. At about the same time, we saw this vent of gaseous vapor. This is gaseous oxygen venting from the strongback next to the Falcon 9 rocket. This is a preparatory step to loading this super cold liquid oxygen into the second stage of the vehicle. This preparation involves chilling down the transfer line. That's the line that flows liquid oxygen from the ground tank, the storage tank out at pad 40, up the strongback, and then into the Falcon 9's second stage. That line needs to be conditioned before loading of the oxidizer, and that's what's going on now. Now 19 minutes, 20 seconds until liftoff of the Falcon 9 with Hotbird 13F. SpaceX's countdown clock is approaching T-minus 17 minutes now. We're standing by for the next call, which should be the start of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. That should be coming shortly. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That really helps us gain a bigger audience for this launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. So if you haven't done so, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And we did just hear that confirmation that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen load is now underway. This is the fourth and final propellant tank to be loaded this morning here at Cape Canaveral. T-minus 16 minutes and counting. The payload for tonight's mission, as I've mentioned before, is Hotbird 13F. This is a television broadcasting satellite owned by Eutelsat, which is a Paris-based geostationary satellite operator, one of the largest in the world. On the right here, you see a picture of Hotbird 13F inside its factory in France, in Toulouse, France, where the satellite was assembled and tested before shipment to the launch site here in Florida. The satellite was built by Airbus. It's based on Airbus's new Eurostar Neo platform. This is the new generation satellite bus design developed by Airbus in partnership with the European Space Agency. It features upgrades to the propulsion system, to the power and thermal control systems on the satellite compared to earlier Eurostar satellite designs. The spacecraft, according to Airbus, has a launch mass of 9,868 pounds, or 4,476 kilograms.
Spacecraft is on internal power.
It's a timely update there on the spacecraft status from Launch Control. Hotbird 13F now is on internal power. This is one of the final steps to configure the satellite for launch. It's off of its ground power supply, will be operating off its own batteries until it's deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket. And at that point, it'll begin generating electricity. Once it deploys its solar arrays, it'll begin generating electricity from its own resources. That power system is vital to the spacecraft, not just to provide electricity for operating different components and systems, but for actually powering the all-electric propulsion system, which combines electricity with xenon gas to produce thrust. This is a plasma propulsion system that'll be used for all the post-launch maneuvers by the satellite in place of conventional liquid rocket engines. And these propulsion thrusters, plasma thrusters, will be actually responsible for maneuvering the satellite from its drop-off orbit, the elliptical transfer orbit, up to a circular orbit at geostationary altitude, where it will orbit in lockstep with Earth's rotation, heading for a position along the equator at 13 degrees east longitude, where the satellite will begin transmitting television signals supporting the broadcast of more than 1,000 TV channels and 500 radio channels to millions of households across Europe in KU band, also reaching Eutelsat consumers in the Middle East and North Africa. So this is a Hotbird 13F, the sole and primary payload for tonight's mission on the Falcon 9 rocket. Its twin satellite is named Hotbird 13G, and this artist concept from Airbus rather, shows what these two satellites will look like in orbit with their solar panels and antennas fully unfurled, beaming these television signals down to Earth. These two satellites will actually fully replace and expand on the capacity of three older generation Hotbird satellites that are nearing retirement in this same position in orbit. T-minus 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Concurrently with loading kerosene and liquid oxygen propellant, SpaceX is also loading cryogenic helium pressurant on board the Falcon 9 rocket. This helium is stored in high-pressure tanks, also called COPVs, or composite overwrapped pressure vessels. And the helium is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks as the Falcon 9 consumes its fuel and oxidizer in flight. So not only are kerosene and liquid oxygen being loaded onto the vehicle, helium, an inert gas used as a pressurant, is also being loaded into the vehicle. The countdown clock has passed the T-minus 11 minute point now. Liftoff from Cape Canaveral remains scheduled for 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. While we wait for the launch 10 minutes from now, we'll ask you one more time, if you haven't done so, please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. This really helps us gain a bigger audience for our live streaming launch coverage from our position here at Kennedy Space Center, just 4 miles away from the Falcon 9 rocket. Also, if you want to support our coverage, there are a couple of ways to do that. You can become a member of our YouTube channel. This helps us maintain and expand our video coverage as well as our coverage of the wider space industry on our website at spaceflightnow.com. If you join and become a member, depending on which membership tier you choose, you can gain access to members-only bonus video features from our coverage here on Florida Space Coast. So we really appreciate that. If you can support our coverage, that would really go a long way to helping us continue to bring you live events like this. You can also contribute through the Super Chat function, as some of you have, and we appreciate that. But if you want to contribute that way, we also would welcome that through the Super Chat function here on our YouTube channel. SpaceX's countdown is now at T-minus 9 minutes and counting. T-minus 7 minutes and 47 seconds and counting. Again, this booster flying tonight, Booster 1069, is going for its third flight to space. It debuted back in December 2021. It was damaged during that recovery. It damaged some of the engines and the landing legs after it landed on the drone ship due to some rough seas. After some repairs, SpaceX returned this booster to service back in August with a Starlink launch with the Starlink Internet satellites. And this booster, again, is going for its third flight today, again targeting a landing on the drone ship out in the Atlantic Ocean. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will be heading due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Here's an overview of what to expect after the launch. The first stage will burn for about 2.5 minutes. It'll exceed the speed of sound in less than 60 seconds after launch. But the first stage will fire its engines for about 2.5 minutes and then separate to begin its descent back toward the drone ship. And a few moments later, the second stage will kick in, light its Merlin vacuum engine with its larger nozzle for a burn to place Hotbird 13F into a preliminary parking orbit. Early on in that burn, it will jettison the payload fairing once the rocket reaches an altitude, a safe altitude above the thick lower layers of the atmosphere. And then first stage landing is expected nearly 9 minutes after launch on the drone ship. But at the same time, the second stage will be ending its first burn. It'll then coast across the Atlantic Ocean, and at T plus 29 minutes, that second stage will relight its Merlin engine for about a minute-long burn. That is going to propel Hotbird 13F, the spacecraft on board, onto an elliptical or oval-shaped or egg-shaped transfer orbit stretching more than 20,000 miles above the Earth, and that will set the stage for separation of Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F TV broadcasting satellite about 36 minutes into the flight. This graphic provided by SpaceX shows some of the maneuvers that will be performed by the first stage booster as it heads back for landing on the drone ship. It'll be performing an entry burn after separating from the second stage, and then a final landing burn with its center engine to slow down for touchdown on the drone ship. All this will be happening while the upper stage performs its mission-critical maneuvers to place Hotbird 13F into orbit. We've heard call-outs in the last couple of minutes that the first stage kerosene tank is fully loaded. So right now, the Falcon 9 has received its full supply of kerosene fuel. About 46,000 gallons of that rocket-grade kerosene is now on board the vehicle. Liquid oxygen will continue flowing into the vehicle down until about T-minus 2 minutes.
Thanks. Pressing for strong back retract.
The next major milestone will be the retraction of the strong back next to the Falcon 9 rocket.
Strong back retract.
We've heard the call that the strong back retract has begun. This begins with the opening of clamps on the top of that strong back mast that wrap around the second stage. Once those clamps are open, the strong back begins retracting. You can actually see that movement. You can see the difference in the location of that strong back from our view a few miles away here at Cape Canaveral. The strong back has reclined away from the Falcon 9 to the right of the vehicle in this view to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the rocket. The countdown clock.
Stage 1, LOX load complete.
The countdown clock now passing T-minus 3 minutes and counting. We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the first stage liquid oxygen tank is full. We should hear a similar call in the next few moments that the second stage liquid oxygen tank is full. And at that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with propellant for liftoff at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. T-minus 2 minutes and counting.
Stage 2, LOX load complete.
We just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen load is complete. So SpaceX now has a fully loaded Falcon 9 rocket. This rocket weighs about 1.2 million pounds 1 million of those pounds is consisting
Gas
of
launch
propellants. Coming up on T-minus 60 seconds. At that point, SpaceX's Falcon 9 will be transitioned to internal power, and the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
That startup call from SpaceX Launch Control confirms that the Falcon 9 rocket's onboard computer is now controlling the countdown.
Go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Standing by for engine start.
9, 8, 7, 6.
There's engine start and liftoff. Liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral, boosting a new generation of European spacecraft technology into orbit with Hotbird 13F, a television broadcasting satellite. We're now hearing the rumble from the Falcon 9's Merlin engines here, about 4 miles away from the launch pad. Falcon 9 is pitching onto a trajectory due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Now rising through a small cloud layer right over the launch pad, continuing right on course, due east from Cape Canaveral with Hotbird 13F, a new TV broadcasting satellite to serve Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Falcon 9 has passed the speed of sound, about a minute into flight. Seeing Falcon 9 through the cloud layer there, arcing east out over the Atlantic Ocean. Now 1 minute, 40 seconds into the flight. T plus 1 minute, 50 seconds, about 40 seconds remaining in the first stage engine burn. At about 2.5 minutes, the Merlin engines on the first stage will be switched off. And that'll be followed a few moments later by stage separation and then ignition of the second stage engine. Looks like we have main engine cutoff. And we can see the second stage engine has lit in the sky, heading east, downrange from Cape Canaveral. Looks like a good stage separation and a good ignition of the second stage. The first stage will begin flying on its unpowered ballistic trajectory on an arc heading toward the drone ship about 400 miles downrange. Good reports from SpaceX Launch Control on a nominal trajectory. Everything looking good. 3 minutes, 25 seconds into the flight. Standing by for payload fairing jettison. And there's confirmation of payload fairing jettison. So the clamshell nose cone has released from the forward end of the second stage. That reveals the Hotbird 13F satellite to the space environment for the first time. Altitude of the second stage now 120 kilometers, passing 9,400 kilometers per hour. A downrange tracking station in Bermuda is now receiving telemetry signals from the Falcon 9. We've now switched over to SpaceX and their feed. This feed does come with a few seconds of latency, a delay, but we are seeing views from the onboard camera on the second stage showing the red-hot glow of the Merlin upper stage engine. This is normal during its burn. The second stage just passed 140 kilometers in altitude and is now accelerating past 10,700 kilometers per hour.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
T plus 5 minutes 40 seconds. Both vehicles, the first stage and the second stage, are remaining on nominal trajectories according to SpaceX.
Stage 1, FTSO safe.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We just saw the entry burn on the far eastern horizon, right over pad 41, basically, ULA's launch pad. We saw that entry burn with 3 of the first stage engines relighting to begin slowing down for landing.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
7 minutes into the flight, we've heard a confirmation of entry burn shutdown from SpaceX Launch Control. All this is happening on the first stage, while the second stage continues in the final couple of minutes of its orbital insertion burn with Hotbird 13F.
Both vehicles continue to follow nominal trajectories.
Stage 1 transonic.
Stage 2, FTSO saved.
Now 8 minutes, 10 seconds into the flight. We're less than a minute now from the expected landing of the first stage. We haven't seen any live video from the first stage yet, so we're not sure if we're going to be able to see this landing live.
Stage 1 landing burn.
We did just hear confirmation, though, that the second stage has completed its orbital insertion burn. Now we're
Nominal
seeing
parking
live
orbit.
video from the first stage booster. Now, during the landing burn, heading for touchdown on the drone ship, less than
Stage 1
30
landing leg
seconds
deploy.
away.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And there you have it, landing booster 1069 on the drone ship. Just read the instructions, completing this rocket's third flight to space. A pinpoint touchdown, pinpoint landing 410 miles downrange from Cape Canaveral. On the right of this screen from SpaceX, you can see the engine bell of the second stage in orbit now after completing its first burn.
Expected loss of signal, Cape.
We're now showing a map from SpaceX showing the positions of the first stage, which is now stationary on the drone ship. And then that map we just cut away from showed the position of the second stage over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We're now seeing an onboard video camera view from the second stage as it coasts through darkness. And there's a view of Hotbird 13F, the payload for tonight's flight. The engine will relight at about T plus 29 minutes, so that's about 18, 19 minutes from now. We'll see that engine reignite for about a minute-long burn. That burn is critical to put the Hotbird 13F spacecraft onto a geostationary transfer orbit, setting up for spacecraft separation.
And expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
We're still hearing some occasional call-outs from SpaceX Launch Control. That last verbal transmission indicated that the Falcon 9's second stage has passed outside the range of a ground station in Bermuda. The rocket will be passing in and out of the ranges of different tracking stations downrange throughout the remainder of the flight. It's already passed over the horizon from the tracking station here at the Cape. Later on, it'll be tracked by several different ground stations in Africa. Now passing T plus 15 minutes, about 14 minutes now remaining until the restart of the second stage engine on the Falcon 9 rocket. Everything so far in this morning's flight appears to be going right according to plan. Liftoff occurred at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 5:22 a.m. UTC. That was at the end of tonight's 1 hour 56-minute launch window. The launch had been scheduled for 11:26 p.m. It delayed to 1:22 a.m. To allow time for additional data reviews on the Falcon 9 rocket. SpaceX's engineers wanted more time to analyze information and data before giving their final thumbs up for launch tonight. But once that was finished, they did give their go for liftoff, and we saw the launch occur a little more than 16 minutes ago now. Good first stage burn was confirmed. The first stage completed its landing on the drone ship about 400 miles downrange from Cape Canaveral. And right now the second stage is performing its maneuvers. It's completed its first burn to place the payload, Hotbird 13F, a communications satellite for Eutelsat, into a parking orbit. And another burn is still to come to boost the satellite into a higher geostationary transfer orbit.
Acquisition of signal, Gabon.
Now 24 minutes and 15 seconds into the flight of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with Eutelsat's Hotbird 13F television broadcasting satellite. We heard about a minute ago that the rocket's second stage is now in telemetry range of a downrange tracking station in Libreville, Gabon, on the western coast of Africa. This map shows the position of the second stage. Passing over the western part of Africa, it'll swing over the Gulf of Guinea area and then head out over the southern part of the African continent over the next few minutes. Now, about 4 minutes or so remaining until the restart of the Merlin vacuum engine for a burn that is expected to last about 60 seconds to propel the Hotbird 13F satellite into a higher orbit before payload separation. Now 27 minutes, 45 seconds into the flight of the Falcon 9 rocket. About a minute and 20 seconds left until the restart of the Merlin vacuum engine. This Merlin vacuum engine will burn the kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants that were loaded into the rocket in the final minutes of the countdown. And this burn is expected to last about a minute. 58 seconds is the exact time that we have according to SpaceX's mission timeline. So this is expected to be about a 58-second maneuver. The Merlin vacuum engine produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust, which is quite a lot of thrust for an upper stage engine. So other rockets may need to fire their upper stage engine for several minutes, even up to 10 minutes in some cases, to perform this burn. Falcon 9's upper stage can do it in about a minute. About 25 seconds left until engine restart.
MVAC startup.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control of MVAC startup, Merlin vacuum startup. And there's a great view from the onboard camera on stage 2 showing that engine lighting, the rocket now in daylight over the African continent. This burn again will last about a minute. You can see that engine now glowing red hot, producing about 200,000 pounds of thrust. SpaceX is providing us with 2 different angles of the Merlin vacuum engine from their cameras on the rocket.
MVAC shutdown.
And there's the verbal call out of MVAC shutdown, engine cutoff. And now we see that visually in the onboard camera view. That lags by a few seconds typically.
Nominal deploy orbit.
And there's the call of nominal deploy orbit. So this means that the second stage did its job. It put the Hotbird 13F spacecraft right in the correct orbit. It was targeting an elliptical or egg-shaped or oval-shaped geostationary transfer orbit with a perigee or low point just a couple hundred miles above Earth's surface, but with a high point or apogee ranging more than 20,000 miles in altitude. And that call from SpaceX Launch Control from the engineer monitoring telemetry from the vehicle confirmed
And acquisition signal HBK.
that the rocket did reach the intended orbit. And we just heard another call out. Another downrange tracking station at Hartebeestok, South Africa is now tracking the Falcon 9 rocket. About 5 minutes now remain until a deployment of the Hotbird 13F spacecraft. Now passing 34 minutes, 20 seconds since the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket with Hotbird 13F. Here's a look at the key stats for this spacecraft, the sole payload for tonight's mission. It's owned by Eutelsat, a Paris-based satellite operator. It was built by Airbus and is based on Airbus's brand new Eurostar Neo satellite platform. This is a new generation satellite design that features upgraded propulsion, upgraded power systems, and upgraded thermal control over Airbus's previous generation satellites. The spacecraft at launch had a total mass of 9,868 pounds. It has plasma thrusters for all of its post-launch maneuvers, so all of its orbit-raising maneuvers after flying off or flying free of the Falcon 9 rocket will be done using plasma thrusters. And it's heading for a post in geostationary orbit over the equator, 22,000 miles above the Earth at 13 degrees east longitude, where it will activate its KU band transponders to begin broadcasting hundreds of TV channels to millions of homes across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa for Eutelsat. Payload deployment is coming up in less than 30 seconds, or about 30 seconds actually. We should see, hopefully we'll see views from an onboard camera on the Falcon 9 rocket showing the Hotbird 13F spacecraft flying off the upper stage in daylight around the east coast of Africa here. Great view from space from an altitude of more than 1,000 kilometers and rising after this big boost into a geostationary transfer orbit a few moments ago.
Payload separation confirmed.
And there we see deployment of Hotbird 13F flying more than 1,100 kilometers above the east coast of Africa. This Airbus-built spacecraft is now free of its launch vehicle after a successful launch from Cape Canaveral nearly 37 minutes ago. Beautiful shots there of the Hotbird 13F spacecraft now on its own in orbit. Over the next few days to weeks, it will run through its post-launch activation steps. It will deploy its own power-generating solar panels to begin recharging its batteries. And then it will activate its plasma thrusters.
And acquisition signal Maldives.
These low-thrust but highly efficient thrusters will be used over the course of the next few months to circularize its orbit. It'll raise that perigee or low point from a few hundred miles up to 22,000 miles. So it'll circularize the orbit over the equator. And then sometime around the middle of next year, Hotbird 13F will be ready to enter commercial service to begin its 15-year operating life for Eutelsat. A twin satellite to this one called Hotbird 13G is scheduled to launch on another Falcon 9 rocket in November. Hotbird 13G is nearly identical to the spacecraft we saw launch tonight. Built by Airbus, owned by Eutelsat, it'll be heading to the same location in geosynchronous orbit at 13 degrees east longitude to join its sister ship to provide television broadcast services over Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. In fact, Hotbird 13G is actually due to arrive at Kennedy Space Center in just a few hours' time on an Airbus Beluga transport aircraft that has brought that satellite from its factory in Toulouse, France, to the United States to begin undergoing final preparations for its launch in just a few weeks in November on a future SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket. So one Eutelsat satellite is out of here tonight in space, another one due to arrive for final launch preps in just a few hours here Saturday at Cape Canaveral. We're now past 42 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. That launch occurred at 1:22 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 5:22 a.m. UTC. Just to recap, we saw the Falcon 9 begin its ascent from Pad 40 at the end of tonight's launch window after a 2-hour delay to evaluate some data and to allow SpaceX teams to complete a final pre-launch data review. That data review was successful, and the launch did go forward at 1:22 a.m. The Falcon 9 headed east from Cape Canaveral out over the Atlantic Ocean. The first stage completed its burn in 2.5 minutes. It completed its descent and landed on SpaceX's drone ship. Just read the instructions, about 400 miles downrange from the Cape. And the second stage completed its tasks as well. It fired its engine twice to place the Hotbird 13F communications satellite for Eutelsat into the targeted geostationary transfer orbit this morning. And that satellite deployed from the Falcon 9's upper stage at about T+36 minutes. We had outstanding views from the Falcon 9 upper stage as it released the 4.5-ton Hotbird 13F satellite to begin its mission in orbit. You're looking at a live shot here of the empty launch pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The Strongback is in its launch position, reclined about 45 degrees. Swung back into that position at liftoff. And that Strongback, which also serves as the transporter and erector for the Falcon 9 rocket, will be lowered horizontal over the coming hours and will be returned to SpaceX's hangar just south of Pad 40, where teams will integrate it with the next Falcon 9 rocket that is scheduled to launch from Cape Canaveral in just 6 days' time. That mission will be carrying a batch of Starlink internet satellites. So the Falcon 9 booster for that mission is already in the hangar at Pad 40, and again will be integrated with that Strongback transporter erector arm in the hangar in the next few days. Ahead a rollout to the pad in preparation for a launch opportunity no earlier than next Thursday, October the 20th, with, again, the next batch of Starlink satellites. That'll be the next launch for SpaceX, also is the next scheduled launch from here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Later in the month, on October the 22nd, an Indian GSLV Mark III rocket, this is the Indian Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle Mark III, will be launching a batch of OneWeb internet satellites from India, from the Satish Dhawan Space Center on India's east coast. This is the first launch for OneWeb since OneWeb's launch campaign was suspended back in March, shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, deteriorating relations between the West and Russia, basically prompted the cancellation of OneWeb's launch contract for launches on Russian Soyuz rockets. OneWeb has now signed contracts with New Space India Limited, which is the commercial arm of the Indian Space Agency, as well as SpaceX, for 5 missions, 2 from India, 3 on SpaceX rockets from here at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, in the coming months to complete deployment of OneWeb's internet constellation. So 5 missions to complete OneWeb's constellation. The first of those remaining 5 missions is set for launch from India on October the 22nd. The satellites are already integrated onto the rocket for launch in a week's time. Later this month, on October the 27th, there's another Starlink launch on a Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40 on the schedule. And then on no earlier than October the 29th, another Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California with another batch of Starlink internet satellites. So as you can see, a lot of the launches over the next few weeks will be deploying internet satellites. These are broadband constellations for Starlink and OneWeb over the next few weeks. This has been a big focus of the satellite market, the commercial launch market as well, over the last couple of years, deploying these satellites to provide high-speed, low-latency broadband internet service around the world. After these next coming launches, the attention will turn to Kennedy Space Center here, where I'm located right now, where SpaceX is scheduled to launch a Falcon Heavy rocket from Pad 39A, carrying multiple satellites into orbit for the United States Space Force. Here's a live shot of Pad 39A right now here at 2 a.m. Eastern Time, where SpaceX crews have spent the last few days reconfiguring hardware on the Strongback transporter erector at Pad 39A to a configuration to support the Falcon Heavy rocket, which is essentially 3 Falcon 9 booster cores strapped together to produce more than 5 million pounds of thrust, 27 main engines at liftoff. And this will be the 4th flight of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket, and the first in about 3.5 years. The last Falcon Heavy occurred back in the summer of 2019. And it's been a long-awaited mission. There's been several Falcon Heavy launches that have been delayed due to payload readiness issues. This particular launch coming up later this month has been delayed 2 years due to payload issues with its U.S. Space Force satellite passengers. The launch is currently targeted for no earlier than October the 31st on Halloween from Pad 39A. Again, this is a Falcon Heavy rocket that will be launched from Kennedy Space Center in just a couple of weeks after a 3.5 year hiatus, actually, in Falcon Heavy missions. And this is one of 12 Falcon Heavy launches that SpaceX currently has on contract. And half of those, about 6 of those, are actually scheduled to launch in the next 12 months. So this could open the floodgates for Falcon Heavy missions over the next few months. We'll see if this holds to schedule for October the 31st with this U.S. Space Force mission coming up. We'll leave you one more time with a look at Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 took off 49.5 minutes ago with Hotbird 13F, Eutelsat's newest TV broadcasting satellite. It's a successful launch this morning from Cape Canaveral. The next SpaceX launch, as we just mentioned, is 6 days away from this same launch pad, Pad 40, at Cape Canaveral with another batch of Starlink internet satellites. Before we sign off, we'll invite you one more time to please support our coverage. You can do that by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. Depending on which membership level you choose, you can gain access to exclusive bonus video features for members only. Also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that for free, and you'll get alerts when we're going live. You'll never miss a launch if you're tuned in and subscribed to our YouTube channel. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark, reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Thanks for joining us for our extended coverage tonight of the Falcon 9 launch with Hotbird 13F. We'll see you next time. Have a great weekend.